Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into a topic that, let's be honest, has a reputation for being, well, a little stuffy. We're talking about Puritan preaching. So, when I say Puritan sermon, what pops into your head? I'm going to take a wild guess. Something super long, really complicated, and, let's face it, pretty boring. Right? That's kind of the caricature we all have. But here's the thing. The historical reality was something else entirely. Way more passionate, way more powerful. You know, a typical sermon was actually about an hour long. It was super practical, and it was delivered with this surprising energy. So you gotta ask, how did they pull that off? Well, it all goes back to their ideal of what a preacher should be. Okay, so to really get their method, we have to look at their ideal first. See, for the Puritans, a preacher wasn't just some guy giving a speech. Nope. They were a spiritual guide, almost like a hero. And the author John Bunyan, he captured this idea perfectly in this really striking word portrait he painted. What Bunyan's describing here, this is a person with a singular, almost cosmic focus. This is not just a guy giving a talk. He calls this person one in 1,000, someone who has the authority to guide people through the toughest parts of life. It just goes to show you the incredible weight they put on this role. And every single part of this picture was symbolic. You've got the eyes lifted to heaven. That's the divine focus. The best of books in his hand, totally grounded in the text, and the world behind his back. That meant he was completely detached from earthly stuff, from worldly rewards. He was aiming for that crown of gold, which was a heavenly reward. Okay, so what was the fuel for this incredibly intense vision? What was the engine driving all that passion? Well, it basically boiled down to 4 foundational beliefs. And these 4 ideas shaped literally everything they did. All right, first up, they were convinced that the only way to get to the heart was through the mind. Their little saying was, all grace enters through the understanding. The idea was that God speaks to our minds first and expects us to, think about it. So the preacher's number 1 job wasn't just to whip up emotions, it was to explain things with crystal clarity. Second, you have to get this. For the Puritans, the sermon wasn't the warm-up act. It was the main event, the absolute climax of worship. And this belief led to some just incredible dedication. You had guys like Charles Simeon who would spend at least 12 hours prepping a single sermon, sometimes double that. There's one story where he supposedly redid a sermon outline 30 times until he felt it was right. 30 times. Third, they saw the Bible as way more than just some dusty old history book. To them, it was active, it was alive. It was like food for the soul. And that meant the preacher's main job was pastoral, like a shepherd. Their role was to literally feed their congregation with this bread of life. So, you see, a good pastor had to be a good preacher. The two were totally linked. And number 4, this one's really interesting. They believed the results, the actual outcome, were totally out of their hands. Think of it like a split in responsibility. The preacher's job, be faithful to the message. That's it. The results, actually changing people's hearts, well, that was God's department. As one of them put it, they were never required to convert anyone, just to be faithful in delivering the message. So these 4 core beliefs, they weren't just a bunch of abstract theories. They directly shaped a really specific, really strategic, and super passionate way of communicating. So now let's get into the how. How did all this theory translate into actual practice? Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. To truly appreciate the Puritan style, you gotta know what they were pushing back against. The popular thing at the time was something called witty preaching. It was basically intellectual performance art, full of flowery language and quotes from classical literature, all designed to entertain the smart people in the room. The Puritans, they hated it. They rejected it completely, called it proud foolishness because it put the spotlight on the preacher, not the message. So they deliberately chose a plain style instead. Yeah, their goal was never to impress people. It was to connect with them. They figured that when you're talking about huge topics like life and death, grace, eternity, the last thing you need is complexity. You need absolute clarity. So they made a point to avoid any fancy language or rhetorical tricks that might make people look at them instead of the message. They had a great name for it. They called it crucifying your style. But don't mistake plain style for simple-minded. Far from it. These guys were incredibly strategic. They didn't just fire off one message and hope it landed. Nope. They developed this whole sophisticated science of application. They'd actually identify all the different types of people listening in the room, from the ignorant and unwilling who really needed a wake-up call, all the way to the humble and desperate who just needed some encouragement. And they would tailor the message for each group. This was targeted communication at its finest. And this whole strategy, it was delivered with just raw, heartfelt passion. The preacher Richard Baxter basically told his fellow preachers, look, you have to feel the weight of what you're saying. He argued that you can't be up there praising these amazing things with your words, but be totally cold in how you say it. The delivery completely contradicts the message. And this quote right here, it just perfectly captures that life or death sense of urgency they felt. So here's the real kicker. For the Puritans, the ultimate test of a good sermon wasn't how much did the audience learn. It was how much did the audience change. The whole point was for the truth of the message to become a real living thing in people's lives. You could say information was just the car, but transformation, that was the destination. So let's step back for a second. If you strip away the 400 years of history, you take away all the specific theology, what are you left with? Well, it turns out you're left with a masterclass in how to communicate powerfully. Their legacy really gives us these timeless principles for communication. It teaches you to start with a deep conviction, know your why. It pushes you to know your audience with surgical precision. It challenges all of us to crucify our style, right? To put clarity way above being clever. And most of all, it reminds us to speak from the heart with real, authentic passion. Because the goal isn't just to give people information, it's to actually see them transform. And that leaves us with one final thought. In our world today, with all the constant noise, the super short attention spans, the endless fire hose of content, isn't there something really powerful, maybe even revolutionary, about their radical focus on one single, passionately delivered message? It's something to think about.